Okay, so this will be a blast from the past for you, going back to Gatsby, people. Um, so some people have told me you've got notes in chapter 7. Some people have said you haven't got notes in chapter 7. I'm just going to start with chapter 7 just to make sure that everyone's got it, and it might revise a few bits for you anyway. Okay. Right. In terms of the chapter, a few kind of main bits that we need to kind of point out from within it. So this is the chapter in which Daisy kind of moves away from Gatsby. She starts to kind of distance herself from him again to return towards Tom. And we need to think about kind of why with that. And we can link in kind of ideas of peripeteia with that, not just for Daisy, but for with Gatsby as well. And this kind of distancing between them. Now, it's worth remembering here that this exam is kind of primarily linking into that kind of American context as part of it. So ideas of kind of that social class and distance between social classes are kind of key here. And they're kind of drawn out on both sides through those kind of recognitions about what each is truly like. Now, through the chapter, Fitzgerald is kind of shaping this kind of overall conflict again between this kind of the new rich figure of Gatsby, between the old rich figure of Tom, and everybody else is kind of caught in the crossfire essentially. And over the course of the chapter, Fitzgerald kind of intensifies this conflict, creates it more and more kind of directly. The other kind of key thing that happens in this chapter is obviously that Myrtle dies, and we're going to use the sheet that will attach to this email to kind of cover the death of Myrtle, to kind of link it in, not just at the moment of death, but how Fitzgerald has kind of built up to this as well, how he's kind of, how he's kind of changed Myrtle across the narrative, or in many ways kept her the same. So the first thing you need to do, we have talked about this before, but just quickly, make sure you've got an understanding of what we mean by this term, peripeteia. It's a kind of Greek term. It generally links with tragedy, but we can kind of apply it slightly more broadly to our different texts here, okay? So just quickly make sure that you've either remember it, or you've got an old definition that you've dug out, or you've just looked it up again. You know exactly what we're on about here. Okay, so within the chapter we get kind of two key moments of this occurring. Now, the first is this kind of seeming recognition of Gatsby, the one that we have definitely talked about before, around kind of Daisy's voice. And it also becomes a kind of moment of peripeteia for Nick as well, okay? So just very quickly, it's going to be a lot of this one today, where I just give you short extracts and you just got to look at them quickly, see what you can draw out, and then I'll talk around them. What can you make from this extract here? What's the kind of key point? What is he kind of showing through it in terms of recognition, a moment of recognition of the kind of truth here? Okay, so within this one, it's interesting that it's initially kind of Nick who's talking. She's got an indiscreet voice, or remarked, is full of, and then the hesitation becomes important because it then allows for Gatsby's recognition. This is Gatsby's voice. Her voice is full of money. And it's, remember, her voice has been a motif running through the text. It's kind of the most beautiful thing about Daisy. It's the thing that brings an extra kind of significance to many events. It kind of intensifies the experience. And Gatsby's moving towards then a recognition potentially that it's her voice that he's been pursuing. It's not her as an individual, but it's her voice and all that she represents. He continues to pursue her here, so it's not a full recognition necessarily of the kind of flaw in this, but it is a recognition in a sense. And then as it kind of goes through, it's Nick's recognition as well. Remember, Nick, we've established at the very start of the narrative, he moves back to the Midwest. So it becomes a recognition for him too. That was it. I'd never understood it before. It was full of money. That was the inexhaustible charm that rose and fell in it. So both of them are realizing, as figures of kind of more of the new rich, of the working richer classes, that it's this wealth that Daisy represents, this legitimacy that both of them find attractive within her. You also get this happening in reverse within the chapter. That's slightly cut off, I'm afraid. It is. Let me just find the page reference for that one. Right, so sorry, this one's on page 128 in the Penguin book, Penguin Modern Classics book. So Gatsby's gone through this kind of process of recognition. Think here, and it's kind of facilitated through Tom, but Daisy also goes through this kind of recognition. And think about how Fitzgerald shapes this around a recognition about Gatsby and how it changes Daisy. Think again, Nick is part of this recognition as well. So what kind of recognition is Nick coming to as part of it too? Okay, so again, have a look at it. Spend kind of somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes. Just go through which bits would you pick out specifically. You can't quote this whole thing. You can talk around it to contextualize it, but then you do need bits of evidence from it. So which bits would you kind of pick out? Okay, so Tom reveals the kind of drugstore business, which is essentially, revealing Gatsby as a gangster figure involved in kind of prohibition. And he goes further than this. But you've got something on now that Walter's afraid to tell me about. And essentially within this is the implication that it's not simply breaking of prohibition, but Gatsby's into some kind of darker stuff than this as well. Now, these kind of recognitions change the perception of Nick and of Daisy. So Daisy is glancing terrified. Nick recognizes for the first time that he does look as if he had killed a man. So Gatsby, this kind of rumor around Gatsby turns from something sort of insubstantial into something that's, there's more of a reality to it. And his face can be described in that fantastic way. It passed, but Nick does recognize that there's, again, more of this kind of dubious nature to Gatsby that maybe he's recognized before. And within this, so Daisy here is kind of moving away from Gatsby, this recognition of Gatsby is not of her own social class, as his money coming from illegitimate areas, whereas her money is kind of legitimate, leads to her drawing away from him. So, but with every word, she was drawing further and further into herself. And only the dead dream fought on as the afternoon slipped away. So we're now moving. The dream has died. It's personified. It's still fighting on, but there's something futile about it. And at the end of this section, her frightened eyes told that whatever intentions, whatever courage she had, were definitely gone. She's moving away from Gatsby, and you see her turning to Tom. Please, Tom, I can't stand this anymore. Kind of begging Tom to end the conflict, to kind of distance her here. So it's important to kind of recognize these changing moments and how they show a distance between these social classes, this kind of incompatibility. Okay, now we're going to kind of go back towards the start of the chapter. I'm just going to go through, I think I've got about sort of seven or eight little bits from the chapter. I'm just going to get you to look at them, to think why they're important, what they kind of show about each social class, and kind of build it up. Okay. So here's our first one, and think about kind of Gatsby's perception here, um, what it's showing about this kind of high class culture, the interests around it. Okay, so a couple of things to note about this one. There's the kind of almost open nature of the affair. Daisy comes over quite often in the afternoons. The fact that he's aware of kind of the gossip culture, so this reflects the kind of scandal culture, gossip culture of that kind of contemporary America. What the other thing that kind of is important here is it's highlighting the artificiality of kind of Gatsby's world. Daisy doesn't approve of it, but it all falls down like a caravansary, and it's fallen down like a card house at the disapproval in her eyes. So Gatsby's world becomes quite a fragile and constructed world, in both of the kind of images here of the kind of tent setup or the house of cards, something kind of insubstantial. So it's about kind of presenting the superficiality of it, the fragile nature of it as well. Then we get our next one. Yeah, so with this one, I'd like to think about how it kind of contrasts that chapter one meeting with Gatsby and Daisy, not Gatsby and Daisy, even Daisy and Jordan. Think about how they've changed here and what that's kind of suggesting about the old rich kind of mentality and what it's kind of revealing here. Okay, so within this, we've got still an image of seeming comfort here in this kind of really hot setting outside, and Fitzgerald's built up the kind of sense of heat. We have this room shadowed well with awnings, was dark and cool. But, and it kind of goes back to those ideas of kind of recognitions happening through the chapter. Daisy and John lay on an enormous couch like silver idols. Now, an idol is essentially a false god, and silver, whilst valuable, is not the most valuable metal. So they've changed from kind of the airy fairies from the kind of opening chapter, and there's something more false about them now. And rather than them being kind of floating around, they're weighing down their own white dresses, and rather than the wind coming through the windows here, we've got the artificial singing breeze of the fans. So there's a recognition as well that there's a kind of artificiality that's kind of associated with them too. Next one, so moving through quite quickly. This is the second, or the actual appearance of the child. So we've had it referenced before. Think about how the appearance of the child is significant, what it shows you about Daisy, how it links into Gatsby's recognitions, and what it shows you about that world of the old rich as well. Okay, so with this, it's the nurse kind of relinquished the child, and there's a kind of distance between child and mother here. She rooted shyly into her mother's dress. So it's kind of showing that within this world of the old rich, there's a kind of distancing, there's again that kind of artificiality, there's a selfish nature to it, as kind of part of it. Daisy's kind of language is quite kind of hyperbolic, and it's kind of rendered ironic by the bit that comes before and just how short a time the child is there for, the blessed precious, um, and it talks about kind of getting powder onto her, this kind of makeup powder, which kind of suggests something artificial, kind of staining the child. Again, potentially reflective of that wider culture. And sorry, the last bit here, Gatsby's recognition comes through it because with seeing the child, he's kind of forced into a recognition of the relationship between Tom and Daisy that he hasn't kind of come to before, and that there was a kind of genuine nature to it. Then we have this one that I would kind of pick out. Their eyes met and they stared together at each other. So within this one, just dead quickly, this is just dead straightforward one. Think about Tom's recognition here, and how it kind of is shaped. Okay, with this one, it's simply the fact that essentially within this culture, there's a talking in euphemisms, essentially, or kind of the double meanings that sort of you always look so cool. She told him that she loved him. Well, she hasn't, but there's kind of always hidden meanings under the surface. There's a kind of hidden coding that goes with it. There's an artificiality, a kind of it's a culture of lies, essentially. What do we have? Okay, so we're now kind of thinking about the picking up of this kind of conflict, and this kind of the breaking of tradition as well. So think about the way within this one that Fitzgerald kind of builds up a sense of irony within it. Okay, so within this we've got something kind of, remember, of the continuation even of the kind of heat imagery that goes throughout the chapter, that kind of motif within the chapter, and here the compressed heat exploded into sound, so there's something kind of disruptive within the image. And you get the portentous chords of Mendelssohn's Wedding March, so that's that one, I think. And there's a kind of irony to this in a kind of novel that's dealing with an affair that is kind of now bringing out, and kind of having this conflict around the affair. We get the reference into the wedding downstairs. There's an irony to this, and there's something portentous about it. So it's sort of ominous, essentially. It's kind of suggesting things of the future. And in this case, it's both the irony of the broken marriage, it's also the kind of breaking of traditional values as well. That in this modern American society, these traditional values are breaking down. It might also be described as kind of foreshadowing Daisy's return to Tom later on in terms of why it's portentous. And Jordan here, imagine marrying somebody in this heat, in this kind of conflict element. Then we get this one. Think about the way that class conflict comes into it. Think about how class conflict is associated with other kinds of prejudice within this. Okay, go. Okay, so think about this one. Tom's main problem here, arguably, is not the affair itself, but it's that Daisy's having an affair with somebody of this kind of lower social class. Now, again, there's an irony in this in the double standard. Tom himself is having an affair with somebody of a lower social class, but the focus is on Gatsby's kind of lack of kind of established social identity. He's Mr. Nobody from nowhere. And he sees this as a kind of disruption of traditional values. People begin by sneering at family life and family institutions. And he even in his mind, this is associated in the same way as his wider racial prejudice. He sees intermarriage between classes as akin to intermarriage between different kind of ethnic, cultural backgrounds. So they'll throw everything overboard and have intermarriage between black and white. So Tom, he's an unattractive character. Arguably, he's the antagonist within this. But the important thing to kind of think here is that he essentially creates an analogy between marriage between different social classes and marriage between different ethnic groups. And to him, these are equally disturbing, essentially. Then we have this one. So think about kind of what we know more widely about Gatsby, about his kind of desires, how it fits into this, and the kind of way that the Daisy's response here kind of disrupts his dreams and his ideals. Okay, so remember with this one we've had kind of Gatsby, and he's kind of described earlier sort of you can't repeat the past. Why of course you can. So Gatsby's kind of under this belief that you can kind of return to the past, you can repeat the past, and Daisy is kind of inadequate to this dream, that she doesn't live up to this dream. Gatsby's dream is stronger than she is. So you want too much. I love you now, isn't that enough? So she has not remained kind of pure to this dream in the same way that Gatsby has. I loved him once, so she does place this love for Tom into the past tense, but it's still an admission of love for Tom. So Gatsby's dream through this, it is given a kind of purity. There's a kind of admirable nature that we can place with this, but it also shows that his dream is kind of flawed, essentially, in many ways. This one again kind of returns us back to our kind of starting point. Think about how kind of Tom is repeating, sort of revealing even the reality of what Gatsby is quickly. Okay, so within this one, it's quite important that again we get the reference back to Wolfsheim. Now remember, and you get this kind of later on in the text as well, Wolfsheim essentially is using Gatsby as the kind of attractive American front for his kind of operations, to give it kind of more of a legitimacy, because obviously Wolfsheim himself is of kind of Jewish background at this point in history. So it returns to that kind of unattractive figure of Wolfsheim. It reminds us once again that Gatsby's wealth comes from a kind of illegitimate world. It shows us that in this time of prohibition, we've got this kind of corruption within America. Okay. I think that's the last one of these. Yeah, okay. So we then need to kind of think just briefly about Myrtle's death. And essentially there is a kind of a tragedy in Myrtle's death. She's kind of failed in her dreams, but there's also a kind of callous way in which Fitzgerald kind of deals with this. And he's essentially kind of killing off the dreams and ambitions that she's embodied within the narrative. He's destroying them. So, hang on a moment. Yeah, so what we need to consider here, and this is where you'll need the sheet that I've given you kind of open alongside, is the way in which her initial introduction kind of, it both links to her death, but there are also kind of differences that come through it as well. So think here, I want you to look at the sheet, I want you to spend kind of 10-15 minutes looking at it, picking out the bits that you would kind of potentially talk about, and think about how she's first introduced, how she's given a kind of power, how that power is kind of taken away from her here. think about the significance of the way in which she dies, and think about the way in which the body is kind of dealt with afterwards. What that shows us about kind of American culture at this point in time. Okay, so the first thing to kind of note is that right from the start, Fitzgerald depicts her in a kind of unattractive way, essentially, in a kind of ominous way. She's a thickish figure. She kind of symbolically blocks out the light from the office door. In terms of her kind of physical description, think about how she kind of contrasts to Daisy. She's in her middle 30s. She's stout. She's got surplus flesh, although she carries it sensually. And from Nick's point of view, her face contained no facet or gleam of beauty. But what is notable about her from the start is that she's got this kind of vitality, that she's still smouldering. Within the Valley of Ashes, she remains the one who is kind of smouldering. And the other thing to kind of note from early on, because again, it provides us a point of contrast, is the fact that she has a kind of complete control over her husband. She smiled slowly and walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. So you get this kind of depiction of her kind of metaphorically walking through her husband, that kind of sidetracking of her husband, and that power is taken away from her at the point of her death here. And you get the reference to the kind of the sensuality around her mouth, her lips, and the voice here. It's not an attractive voice the same way as Daisy's is. It's a kind of coarse voice, but she is kind of, the focus on the mouth again. Now, as you go further through, as we get into chapter 7, the first thing to note is that she's lost control over her husband here. When he came outside again a little after 7, he was reminded of the conversation because he heard Mrs. Wilson's voice loud and scolding downstairs in the garage. "Beat me," he heard her cry. "Throw me down, beat me, you dirty little coward." A moment later, she rushed into the dusk, waving her hands and shouting. Before he could move from his door, the business was over. So remember, Wilson has kind of confined Myrtle within this. He's planning to kind of take her away, to move her, and she kind of, now she's in kind of complete conflict with her husband. She's lost the kind of power here that she had before. And then you get the actual kind of the death itself. So really think about the description of this death. This is something you can make quite a good point around, especially as we kind of go down. Her life violently extinguished. So the contrast from before, where she's smouldering, is kind of transformed and she's extinguished now. That kind of fire imagery with it being put out, and her dark bloods are mingled with the dust, or knelt in her road and mingled her thick dark blood with the dust. So Myrtle is a figure who's been desperately trying to escape the Valley of Ashes, to move away from it, and here Fitzgerald puts her right back into it, her blood mingling with the dust. He kind of puts an end to her dreams in that sense. And again, think about the way her body's treated by Fitzgerald at this point. You get the kind of the left breast swinging loose like a flap. So this kind of symbol of kind of sensuality, of kind of maternal nature here, is kind of ripped from her. It's destroyed. And the mouth, we get the reference to kind of rip at the corner of her mouth, as if she choked a little, giving up that tremendous vitality that she stored up for so long. So again, it kind of takes those images that we have when she's first introduced and her voice is taken away. She's kind of broken at this point. And as we go through, the heat has kind of gone out of her body. Even in this really hot day, she's wrapped in a blanket and then another blanket, as though she suffered from a chill in the hot night. So it kind of reflects that, again, going out of the fire within her, that extinguishing of something within her. And you get, yeah, simply the placing of her on the table and the kind of gawking crowd shows this kind of gossip culture, that fascination with death. We've got, as you go slightly further up, the reference to the death car, as the newspapers called it, didn't stop. So the death, this kind of tragedy, becomes something within this American culture that is kind of dwelt upon, is kind of an interesting point in that sense. The last thing to note is that obviously it's Daisy that kind of mows her down. So Myrtle, who is trying to move up, trying to almost usurp Daisy to take her position, is essentially killed off by Daisy. She cannot become Daisy. That's kind of an impossibility here. Right, last thing to just look at very quickly within this chapter. If you look at the end of the chapter and just use the last couple of pages at the end of the chapter, I just want you to think, what kind of imagery, what kind of things does Fitzgerald use to kind of suggest the reasons that Daisy and Tom remain together? Why does she choose Tom over Gatsby? So again, just reread over the closing pages of the chapter. Think about what you can identify in terms of Fitzgerald's implications here. What is he suggesting the reasons underlying it are? Okay, so if we look at the very end of the chapter, what we kind of see that's important here is that this reconciliation kind of takes place within the kitchen, and it's done in a very kind of domestic kind of way. It returns us to a kind of more traditional family setting. So they're sitting either side of the table, and there is this kind of the cold fried chicken between them, the two bottles of ale. It's this kind of domestic and traditional ideal that kind of keeps them together in many ways, this kind of marriage ideal, and breaking that would be something disruptive. And it returns them to this kind of natural intimacy around this picture. And what else do we want from this bit? Hang on a second. That was it. Yeah, there is still a pressure of kind of Tom here. He was talking intently across the table at her, and in his earnestness his hand had fallen upon and covered her own. Once in a while she looked up at him and nodded in agreement. So yes, there's a pressure from Tom, but there's a kind of following of Daisy. It's all placed within this kind of domestic setting, though. This is important. And Gatsby here, it's kind of key that he's left standing outside this. He's standing watch, he's standing at vigil here. There's something, vigil is often associated with something kind of holy. You have a kind of holy vigil, but he's still placed outside of this kind of domestic setting. He is not part of it, and he cannot truly enter into it because he simply doesn't fit within this kind of domestic world. Okay, as a brief kind of summary, the chapter's important because it's a turning point chapter. You get those kind of recognition elements. We get a number of other kind of wider points of kind of conflict that come into the chapter and build up around the chapter. We have the kind of engagement with Myrtle's death and the way that that kind of creates a pattern across the text, how it deals with the kind of plight of the poor, how she's returned to where she came from. And then we have the reasoning around Daisy and Tom remaining together. The traditions bind them more fully than Gatsby can kind of truly overcome at the end here, okay? Hopefully that's useful. I would say that points out the kind of key main bits within the chapter. Obviously there are other bits within the chapter you can use. This is just me kind of summarising within a reasonable time space the key elements of the chapter.